a few minutes. Alright, hi everyone, thank you so much for coming to our talk. We're glad to see a lot of different faces here than we have at other events. Alright, so on behalf of the Language Diversity Ambassadors, we're going to be presenting the sociolinguistic legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And before I turn it over to our speakers, I just wanted to briefly introduce them. So I have their bios here. So sitting in the front row is Walt Wolfram. He has pioneered research on social and ethnic dialects since the 1960s, and he's still working to disseminate important information about language variation to the public. And this is just another opportunity for him to do that, and he's very grateful for it. So thank you for coming. Over here on my left is Caroline Myrick. She's a PhD student in sociology, studying sociolinguistics with a focus on gender, language ideologies, underrepresented communities. She teaches courses in sociology, English, and women and gender studies, and is on our Language Diversity Ambassadors leadership team. John Forrest is also a PhD student in sociology, also studying sociolinguistics and workplace studies. His research focuses on the ways in which the workplace conditions language use and the effect of occupation on language variation and change. And finally, we have Michael J. Fox. He's also a graduate student in sociology. His research interests focus on pronunciation changes across time with a focus on local social ecology and how it's embedded in the larger social context. So again, thank you so much for being here. I'm going to turn it over to our speakers. Shut the door.
Strangely, she asked for a bio, but she didn't read the one I sent her.
Walt Wolfram is Walt Wolfram. This is the line that
I said I'm old as dirt, but I'm still correct. That's what she was supposed to say. Okay, so we want to talk about the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King as a sociolinguistic figure. And it's really interesting that one of the things that is often eliminated from Black History Month is the language of Black Americans. How many of you have ever been to a lecture on the language of Black Americans in Black History Month? Oh, nobody. Oh, one person, right? Okay, which is really ironic because, one, it's the most significant non-mainstream English variety in American English. 2, it's the most controversial. 3, it's the variety about which people know the least in terms of its history. And yet, this is, so we won't attribute that to a sinister Trumpian plot, but because it happened long before he became the president, but it is a glaring omission. And so we're trying to rectify that somewhat by things that we do. And our point is that while we are interested in analyzing how he talked, because it's really significant, but that it also fits in with themes related to injustice. And so what we're going to do is talk about the way he talked, and then talk about what it says in terms of social justice with respect to language on the campus of North Carolina State, or just about any place, okay? The fact of the matter is that when it comes to discrimination, language is one of those things that is continues to be accepted by the population. So if people don't get a job because of their color or their gender or their sexual preference, they're in court in a minute. But if you don't get a job because of the way you talk, and it doesn't fit somebody's prescriptions for how you should talk, they go away, feel bad about themselves. All right. So there's this vast area of discrimination related to language. Now, in the King tradition, you know, we all know that he's this great rhetorician, and you know, his I Have a Dream speech is rated, however people rate these things, as the #1 speech of all time in American society. And so there's no question about that. And there are probably a zillion or more articles about his rhetorical style. If you take a course in rhetoric and so forth, you'll certainly run across them. But in the King tradition, also there's this whole notion of different audiences that he talks to, how he talks to them, his performance, and how he interacts with people, which is something. All right? And then one of the questions that comes up is, how did he talk to different audiences, and what did this say about who he was and what stances he took with the American public, all right? What did he change, what did he keep the same, and what does that say about him, and what does that say about language regard? And then the last issue, what we want to talk about, is what does this say about language and social justice? And as far as we're concerned, you know, issues of social justice and language are still highly sort of dismissed and exorcised from the canon of diversity. And so we want to talk about this. And also I'd like to just seeing Jason Miller, I'd like to say it seems like NC State is becoming sort of well known for its probing of things related to Dr. Martin Luther King, and we like to consider this as a contribution to that as well. All right, and in terms of the African American community, there are a number of quotes and studies that have showed what a prominent role it has in terms of that community. Now, one of the things that we of course explore about King is sort of his social networks, which you can see here. This is a social network done in the journal Black Theology. You know, and one of the prominent things, of course, is he was a product of the Black church, a prophetic tradition. He also was aligned with liberal Protestantism and so forth. And in that context, he was, in terms of his youth, he was a person who grew up in this sort of tradition of a Black church. You know, his father and his grandfather, actually his grandfather started the church, and his father also pastored that church, so it was important. So to give it some context, we're actually working on a film now, which will premiere on March 23rd in the Hunt Library, called Talking Black in America, The Story of African American Language. I've been doing research on this for almost 50 years, that's why I'm as old as dirt. And but this will be the first film ever devoted to this topic, which is really another curiosity. And even ourselves, we've done 11 TV documentaries, but we've never done one on African American speech. We've done them on the Outer Banks, on Lumbee English, and so forth. So to give you a little context in which he grew up, I'll play you a little vignette, which we hope will sort of entice you to also come to the premiere. And this is the context of a Black church in which he grew up. You may recognize this church. It's a church where Barack Obama attended, and presumably when he goes back to Chicago will attend. It's also the church of Jeremiah Wright, who some of you may recall was a controversial figure. All right, and you'll see, actually as it turns out, Jeremiah Wright, whatever his status was in terms of controversy, is a very astute observer of language and how it operates in the Black church. Oh, okay. Come on. Come on.
You grow up in an environment where people use language metaphorically, analogically. It just becomes like air. And then I grew up in the church. So growing up in the church, there would be all this improvisation they would do. The Spirit is taking over and all sorts of stuff is going on. I mean, they're just like kicking out these lyrics and talking about their lives like on the fly, on the spot. And that is really when I became aware of hip hop culture and freestyle as a part of it.
In terms of engaging the heart, the preacher has to be very nimble and understanding where all of the people are. And so it's important to speak vernacular, especially to get a point across or to utilize humor. And then also sometimes to be formal, to draw in those who come out of a more academic tradition or a more European tradition. And then there are others that want to see that moment of improvisation where the spirit takes over and you fly from the page and something unique is created in the process of communication.
Well, the speech event in Black English and the speech event in the Black church includes bodily expressions. One of the things, the differences between African speech and European speech is European speech, like tonight on the news, talking heads. That's it from Channel 5. What do you say, Sue? What do you say, Mom? Right? When Black people talk, they get involved with the body. The body is a part of the speech event. Homiletics, when I was back in school, said, no, you don't do that. That distracts from the message. The oral tradition and language are key, they're central. Without language, you would have no Black church because it had been against the law to teach Africans how to read or write. The oral tradition and the oral tradition were the sum and substance of Black church.
She's right here, right there, right before us. And may we as adults get out of the way sometimes.
It's a give and take, it's a dialogue that goes on. Call and response. The preacher says something, the congregation says something back. That's very different from European worship. They don't say anything back. In fact, they're taught not to say anything. They're not disruptive. You're disrupting service. Missionaries taught us that. You don't disrupt service. Be quiet and let the minister finish.
Okay, so that sort of gives you an idea of the context. And this is not about sort of class. I mean, this is a church that Barack Obama goes to that has people of all different social classes. So we've seen from our analysis that we have to take into consideration the Black church, you know, and traditions, prophetic tradition of preachers such as him, the civil rights movement, and liberal political philosophy. So in that context, what we did was we analyzed a bunch of linguistic features that our students are going to talk about, our grad students. And so we analyzed these features in 4 different settings, and the I Have a Dream speech, which we've all played to you, because everybody presumably knows that. The Nobel Prize acceptance speech was to a very different audience. A Merv Griffin interview, which is sort of a one-on-one interview, and then I've Been to the Mountaintop, which is a speech that he gave before he was assassinated the night before that. So just to give you an idea, we'll give you a little taste of these.
I accept this award today with an abiding faith in America and an audacious faith in the future of mankind. I refuse to accept despair as the final response to the ambiguities of history. I refuse to accept the idea that the isness of man's present nature makes him morally incapable of reaching up for the eternal oughtness that forever confronts him. I refuse to accept the idea that man is mere flotsam and jetsam in the river of life, unable to influence the unfolding events which surround him.
Well, you get the idea. I mean, as he said, as Jeremiah was talking about, I mean, you can see the catatonic white audience that has no response at all. Now we'll compare this to the church at the Masonic.
All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I
I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over that. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right.
So you can see the sort of contrast there between the two audiences. And the third and the fourth one that we looked at was an interview with Merv Griffin, which is a talk show host and just a one-on-one interview.
Do you visit here often?
Oh, I'm in New York almost every other week at least. There's
Quietly,
always
though.
something happening in New York, so you can't avoid coming to New York.
You've discovered it's a fun city?
Well, I haven't quite discovered that side of New York.
Really?
Being a Baptist clergyman, they keep me involved in other areas.
Right. Your home is actually in Atlanta. Atlanta, Georgia. Have you lived there all your life?
I was born in Atlanta and went to school in Atlanta through college, and then I went to theological seminary and graduate school in the north, in Pennsylvania and in Massachusetts. And then I went back to the south for my first pastorate in Montgomery, Alabama, where I lived for 6 years. And then I returned to Atlanta in 1960, and I've been there ever since.
Do you have a church at this time in Atlanta?
Yes, I am the co-pastor of the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, and my father is pastor, so we are working together there as a team.
Both you and your father?
That's right. They put up
Is there any
two
seniority?
kids. Well, he makes it clear, sometimes consciously and sometimes unconsciously, that he is the pastor, and I'm the co-pastor.
Okay, so this gives you an idea of quite different contexts and interactional settings and audience. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go through some actual linguistic features that we've analyzed and show how they're distributed in these different contexts and what that says about King.
All right, so I'm going to walk you through the first couple features here. And one of the big reasons we're doing so many things at once is in sociolinguistics we'll talk about, like how do you pronounce your vowels differently, or how do you pronounce your T's. But when we think about these things, when we hear people talk, one of the big things is that you don't read things individually. If I say one word, that doesn't mean a lot to you. But if I'm saying a whole sentence and I'm doing a lot of things at once, we're trying to look at everything that King's doing, everything he's manipulating, and what it might mean. So first, I'm going to start out with in versus ing. So when I'm talking about in versus ing, that means like saying walk in versus walking, right? And this is something we all do. Pretty much everyone switches between these in some contexts and in some situations. And when we talk about in and ing, we have some meanings associated with what, when somebody says either in versus ing, they mean different things to us. And sometimes we call this indexicality or indexing. So if I say index, it's sort of this meaning that comes along with any sort of linguistic variant. So when we're talking about ing, like if I say walking, the things that come to mind for people are things like education. Oh, it's educated, this might be a formal setting. You might be trying to exert more effort, sound more articulate, more pretentious sometimes, depending on the situation. So a lot of these meanings are coming about, and depending on the situation and the other things that somebody's doing, some of these meanings might be more emphasized than others. But on the other hand, when we talk about in, we get these gray meanings on the outside, right? So this idea of being uneducated, to be easygoing or lazy, again, depending on the situation. Some people are like, oh, that person must be very friendly. Sometimes it's like, oh, they're very lazy, inarticulate, and not trying too hard. And sometimes it's this feeling of relaxed. So there's a lot going on with this variable depending on the context and depending on what someone is doing otherwise. So I wanted to give you an example kind of how this works in politics. Since we see this all the time happening in politics, where you'll see like about every couple months there will be some article about a politician dropping their G's and how horrible it must be that they are doing that on stage. One of the big ones was Obama back a couple years ago, who was dropping his G's in this speech right here.
Take off your bedroom slippers. Put on your marching shoes. Shake it off. Stop complaining. Stop grumbling. Stop crying. We are going to press on. We've got work to do.
So it's something that everyone does, but a lot of times politicians are under special scrutiny in the situations that they're in. People really notice when they say like marching shoes or something like that rather than marching shoes. And if you listen to him talk, and I mean he's really obviously like very emotionally invested in this too, but you get a different feeling. If he said marching shoes and like they used ing for all those words, you probably have a very different read of his speech. Contrast this with a little clip from the farewell speech he gave not long ago.
All of us, regardless of party, should be throwing ourselves into the task of rebuilding our democratic institutions. When voting rates in America are some of the lowest among advanced democracies, we should be making it easier, not harder, to vote.
So think about, again, like if we flip the script here and he talked about throwing ourselves into, like talking about voting rights and stuff, you'd have a very different read of this speech. So politicians a lot of times will manipulate what they're doing with this variable to give you a different feeling to the speech and what they're trying to accomplish. So we looked at how much King used ing versus in each of these 4 speeches that we're talking about. And I have a bar plot for you, just the percent time he used ing versus in. So 100% here is 100% ing. And the really big thing to note here is those 2 bars on the left and right are the dream and the Nobel Prize speech. So in the I Have a Dream speech and the Nobel Prize speech, he used not one in. And there are a lot of reasons for this. One of the big ones is that these are the Nobel Prize especially is incredibly formal, a white audience that is, it's about the most formal thing you can do. And the dream speech was, again, on a national stage, very formal. He was presenting himself a particular way. But if we move to the Merv Griffin and Mountaintop speeches, we see more of him switching back and forth between these 2 variants. And what does that mean? Well, in the Merv Griffin case, it's likely just about the relative informality of that interview compared to the speeches. He's not up there in front of a podium giving a speech. He's giving an interview. It's still on television, so it's probably not as relaxed as it could be. But in comparison to doing the I Have a Dream speech or something like that, he's probably trying to just be a little more casual than he would be. The Mountaintop speech, I think, tells a little bit different story, even though he's using invariants, because they can mean different things, right? In this case, the Mountaintop speech, because it was given in essentially like a sort of black church sort of setting that Walt was talking about, he's probably performing a little bit of blackness and like this preacherly persona when he's up there. Because in and ing also have ethnic connotations too. In is also associated with the speech of African Americans, so he's leaning a bit on that identity. He's trying to pull that out and connect with his audience in that way. Moving on to a different feature here, so T-release. So T-release, what does that actually mean? What does T-release mean? For that, I will throw it to Tay Swizzle, who gives us the best example of T-release.
Just think, while you've been getting down and out about the liars and the dirty, dirty cheats of the world, you could have been getting down to this sick beat.
So that part at the end where she says beat, right? When you're saying the letter T in words, you can either say something like beat, or you can say beat. And those mean very different things, just like in and ing mean very different things. So when you fully articulate a T like that, when you release it, it again looks articulate, it looks like you're being formal, that sort of thing. So we measured that for MLK, and I have a couple examples of what that sounds like for him. And this is when we're coding things, this is what things look like for us when we're looking at the waveforms. So here's Martin Luther King's release T.
Poverty. Poverty.
Not as extreme as the Taylor Swift one, but very few are. So poverty. And the next one is a different sort of T that isn't released.
looking at it real.
So you hear at it realistically rather than at it realistically. So again, we looked at all the different places that you could release your T or not release your T, and tabbed this by speech. And again, we see a pretty clear pattern emerging for T release, right? You know, I was talking about how the Nobel Prize speech is so formal in front of this white audience. And this is where by far he uses the most variants of release T, right? Trying to sound the most formal, the most articulate for this situation. And again, the dream speech is a little less than that, but still shows substantially more than the other two. He's releasing a lot of his T's comparatively to some other contexts, but there's a little bit of a difference there. And then in both Mountaintop and Merv Griffin, he's releasing very few of his T's. And again, why is he doing that? Again, there might be some different meanings here because the Merv Griffin thing is more relaxed, but the Mountaintop speech, again, he's trying to perform a different identity because it's a formal speech, but he's trying to do something different identity-wise to connect with his audience. And he's using his release T's for that. So now we'll move on to other features.
All right, so moving on from one consonant to another that has a lot of meaning, we're going to talk about R-lessness. So you've probably already noticed R-lessness in King's speech already, just from the clips we've listened to when he said things like despair instead of despair. That's what we're talking about when we talk about R-lessness, that R is absent after vowels. And there was a lot of talk about R-lessness last year during the campaign season, especially related to the speech of Bernie Sanders. So I wanted to play a clip that kind of talks about R-lessness and what it is. All right.
New York roots in his R's, or actually in his lack of R's.
Within the Democratic Party, our computers.
Denmark.
In November.
Like the dialects from Boston, and Savannah.
I like to go under the speed limit.
The New York City accent is historically non-rhotic, meaning R's often get dropped except before vowels. So newscasters call him
Bernie Sanders.
but he calls himself
Bernie Sanders.
R dropping is something that became fashionable in London in the late 1700s, before spreading to the east coast of the US.
There must be an end to speculation with other people's money.
But now it too is fading.
After the Second World War, it lost its prestige.
Americans were focused on their own identity rather than maintaining ties to England. And as pop culture increasingly portrayed New Yorkers as criminals, the stigma led some to intentionally lose their accents.
So this goes on to
as
talk
with
about
all dialects.
how the R-lessness in New York City is fading out, but you heard them mention the Savannah. I like to drive under the speed limit, right? You heard that R-lessness there. This was something that at the time was still considered prestigious sounding, but also very Southern sounding, right? You heard Miss Daisy and Driving Miss Daisy say under the speed limit, right? And that sounded quite Southern, but quite aristocratically Southern, right? You could tell that she's Southern, but fancy Southern, right? So what's going on with King's R's? As I said, you probably noticed that he drops a lot of his R's. We call this R-lessness. So here's some examples from some of those speeches.
Crying out for brotherhood. Crying out for brotherhood.
This is him saying years.
To live just a few years. To live just a few years.
And awarded.
This prize is awarded to a movement. This prize is awarded to a movement.
So do you hear that lack of R? That's what we're talking about when we say R-lessness. And this is arguably one of King's most iconic features of his speech. When you have people imitating him or playing him in roles, this definitely is something that probably stands out to you, whether you thought about it as being an R or not. But he does have some R's that pop up every now and again, such as in this example.
And I see God working in this period.
Right. So what did it look like when I sat there and counted up all of the times where he could have said R and how many times he did? Well, here's what it looked like. So on the x-axis, we've got the different speeches and settings. On the y-axis, you can think about the highest as being the most R-less, so like despair, versus the bottom, which would be like despair. So as you can see, he is quite R-less, and not only is he quite R-less, he is across contexts with not much difference. So this is quite different from John's findings, which showed a lot of manipulation happening based on formality or based on audience and location and the event itself. So we can see that this is definitely part of his ethnic and regional dialect. This is very much something Southern and Black for him, and it's not something that he's changing based on context. So this is pretty cool to think about someone that, as Walt said, is one of the most iconic speakers of all time, and someone who's really showing his Blackness and his Southernness in his speech. It's pretty cool to think about that way. Okay, so you might have also heard earlier at the very beginning that some of his R's don't just sound like They sound a little different. And I noticed that when I was counting. And I said, these sound different. So when we looked at these R-full instances, we found that a lot of them were actually what we call taps. So it kind of sounds, I won't get too much into like the phonetic phonology stuff of it, but it sounds like a trill. So listen to the second R in river and the R in picture.
In the river of life, in the river of life.
In the river of life. And then listen to picture.
And get a quick picture of all that. And get a quick picture of all that.
Crazy, right? Like none of us expected to find that in his R's, but he uses it a lot actually. And so we are interested to see, how much he did that, and we found that actually the majority of his R-full instances were these taps. And we don't have too much time to get into like what this tap is, but at the time this was considered a very prestigious pronunciation of R. So you can hear it in some, FDR type speeches, other types of speeches during that time that fancy people like politicians would do. You'll actually, if you go back and listen to folks during this time who had positions of power, they use this fancy sounding R. So that was pretty cool for us to find. Okay, so moving on to some other, I promise we're not doing all consonants tonight, but we've got some consonant clusters that we gotta talk about. So what is a consonant cluster? Well, it's basically a cluster of consonants. So, 2 or 3 consonants in a row, side by side. So here's an example of how we actually reduce consonant clusters pretty frequently in our everyday lives. So would you call this whipped cream, or would you call it whipped cream? If you say the latter, whipped cream, that's an example of consonant cluster reduction. I didn't actually know it was called whipped cream until I was like 20. I just thought it was whipped cream because so many people reduce that consonant cluster. Another example would be, did Muhammad Ali get in a fist fight? Or did he get in a fist fight, right? Most of us in our natural everyday speech are going to say a fist fight. During a formal presentation, we're probably going to say a fist fight, right? And so for those same reasons that John mentioned of it can index either education, articulateness, hoity-toityness, versus relaxed, versus sometimes uneducated. And so we get that same split here. And we actually have them in the same ways that John talked about with his features. These tend to index regional and ethnic identities. So this consonant cluster reduction with fist fight and whipped cream gets associated with varieties like African American English. Even though everyone does consonant cluster reduction, African American English actually shows higher rates of it and higher rates in certain contexts as well. So what did King's consonant clusters look like? I know you're dying to know. So he did have some, many examples where he didn't reduce his consonant clusters. We're going to just call these full. They were just full consonant clusters. So you'll hear remind.
To remind America.
So he didn't say remind. He said remind.
To remind America.
And same here, not lift, but
to lift our nation.
To lift our nation, right? But he also did reduce a lot of his consonant clusters. So listen to promised land.
On toward the promised land. On toward the promised land.
Consonant cluster reduction. And then here's the word honest.
To be fair and honest.
And if you're wondering, did she just clip the end of it off? I didn't. And I'm happy to talk about the process of, looking at these later on. And he actually had lots of sentences where he involved both. And so we've got blue with full, orange with reduced, and you might notice a pattern of having the reduced on the end for emphasis.
The view that mankind is so tragically bound.
Pretty cool, and iconically.
Free at last! Free at last!
Pretty cool, right? How he's using these things not only to index southernness and blackness, but also using them rhetorically as well. So across his speeches, I'm not going to get into like the morphosyntax stuff of mono and bimorphic consonant clusters, but I would love to talk to you about that later if you're interested. But what's important for us is to realize that overall, mountaintop speech had the most instances of this reduced form. And because it is associated with blackness and southernness, this was kind of a cool finding, but an unsurprising finding because this is a setting that's in the South, in Memphis, and also has a predominantly black audience. So, yeah, there we go. So, in case you were doubting my math on that, overall, use the most consonant cluster reduction in that mountaintop setting. So that was pretty cool to find a way, just dealing with consonant clusters, which you don't really think about when you're talking, that he was manipulating in many of the same ways that we saw with John's results. And what's even cooler, if you didn't think consonants were cool enough, is we actually compared MLK's consonant cluster reduction rates to rates of other speech communities. So we have got MLK compared to white Northerners that are upper class, African American Northerners who are middle class, Southern white working class, and Southern African American working class. And what's so interesting is that we see that he really is aligning himself with the Southern African American working class, even more so than other African American communities or other Southern communities, right? So it's pretty amazing how consciously or unconsciously with his language, he's able to align himself with this very specific identity. It's pretty cool. All right, so moving on from consonants, we're going to talk about copulas. When we talk about copulas today, we're really just talking about the is and the are verbs, is and are. And we're going to talk about the fact that sometimes, especially in African American English, we can have copula absence. And so that means either is absence or are absence. And honestly, when Walt told me he wanted me to look for these, I was like, MLK isn't going to have any absence. I was like, there's no way. But actually, it was kind of silly of me to think that because lots of prominent people, prominent orators and politicians, actually, if they do have African American English as one of their native dialects, they do this all the time. So here's an example, if you don't believe me, of Obama at Ben's Chili Bowl. And I want you to listen to this clip starting around here. Do you hear that? No, we straight. So here we have an absence of are. It's not we are straight or we're straight, it's we straight. So it's a perfect example of Obama using copula absence. So like I said, didn't expect to see King doing this. However, let's see what we actually found. As expected, and actually more so than expected, he used full is and are verbs. So not contractions, but actual like is and are. Think about how often you actually say is and are versus apostrophe s and apostrophe re. Not a lot, but in speeches, of course, we hear it.
All those to whom truth is beauty, collectively we are richer.
So not surprising for a speech to have a lot of is and a lot of are. We did find a lot of contractions as well.
That's always the problem.
All right. We actually did find some copula absence. Here's an example.
Now we're going to march again, and we've got to march again.
So that was pretty cool to find. So if we break down is absence and are absence, here's what we found. With the is, we found that he didn't do any is absence. And is absence tends to be one of the most stigmatized features of African American English. So if you think of, if I were to say like, she crazy or he funny, that is a very stigmatized way of stating that, because we have is absence. He didn't do that, but he did have a lot of contractions in the middle two contexts, which, unsurprisingly, are the less formal contexts, right? 100% is formed from the other two, which are the most formal. If we move on to R, we see he actually did have R absence. And once again, unsurprisingly, it's in those middle two, which are the less formal, and also in the case of Mountaintop, the one in which he's indexing his blackness the most. So it was pretty cool to find those. All right, so we talked about consonants, we talked about grammar. Let's move on to vowels.
All right, so vowels, often overlooked when we talk about African American vernacular English, but are sometimes stigmatized, sometimes not stigmatized, sometimes fly completely under the radar. But King, growing up in the South, he was exposed to two different types of vowel systems that, to some extent or another, influence the way he talks. The first one is the African American vowel shift, and I'll explain what the configuration of these plots mean and what the arrows mean in a second. And the other one is a slightly more complicated Southern vowel shift, which is something that most people here have probably heard, especially if you grew up in the rural South. It's changing in urban areas nowadays, but is still around and was definitely around at that time. So the African American vowel shift. When we look at vowels, when we measure vowels, we measure them in terms of like the acoustics. So this places them into an XY type plot where we can look at them in relative position. And essentially, when a vowel starts to move towards another one, it starts to sound like another one, and we can graph that out. So one of the features of the African American vowel shift is the vowel in bot fronts towards the vowel in bat. You can hear that in this example here. This woman is from Memphis. A lot of these clips are from all over the South, Memphis, and I think actually quite a few from Durham.
She gonna stop us in the car and was like,
So can you listen to the stop?
she gonna stop us in the car and was like.
The second feature is the A vowel starts to sound like at.
Book bag.
So it sounds like book bet versus book bag. And the third one is bet starts to sound like bit.
I'm thinking about going downtown.
Now, the southern vowel shift is probably something that you've heard before, so some of these will seem pretty familiar. It starts with, again, a raising, but in a different type of way. So in addition to more of a at sound, you also get a glide, so it's yin. Sounds like a diphthong. We also get bed and bait switching. So bet sounds like bait, and bait sounds like bet.
Bad.
And then the other one, so bit sounds like beat.
Beat.
That's the wrong one, sorry.
Kids.
That's in
Kids.
And then beat sounds like bit.
Bang.
Okay, so while King doesn't actually show any features of the southern vowel shift, he does, the absence of the southern vowel shift in his speech is noted because he's African American, and typically the southern vowel shift is ethnically marked for whiteness, let's put it that way. Okay, so he did show raising of a in line with his black contemporaries, like the African American vowel shift. So the a vowel sounding like bet or higher or bait. In all the contexts all of the speeches, he consistently raised his A before nasals more than he did any other A, any other A vowels. And this was the same across all speeches, indicating that he wasn't manipulating it. He wasn't marking himself as different or trying to change the way he was indexing his ethnicity or southernness across contexts. So here you can hear an example of him with a raised A.
You can't ride a man's back unless it's bent. You can't ride a man's back unless it's bent.
And then another example where it's the same word but lower.
That the man for whom I'm named.
Okay, but even though he doesn't exhibit any of the features of the Southern vowel shift, he does manipulate one of the most iconic features of Southern English. So the ungliding of the bi vowel, or the I vowel, where in pre-voiced consonantal contexts, you get an unglided I. So bad and bite is the variation that we see in Southern English. So I'll give you some examples. So it's in words or syllables that don't end in a consonant at all, where it's completely open, and in syllables that end in a voiced consonant. So,
Ga.
Monophthongization of ga.
Ga.
Or ungliding of ga. Ga. I can't do it. And then also side.
Tom, sad. Tom, sad.
And then when the syllable ends in a voiced consonant or a voiceless consonant, you get gliding.
Nice height. Nice height.
So I, nice, heights versus sad, time. Now he unglides across all contexts, right? So this is the output of some statistical modeling that shows that the voiced and voiceless, on the bottom of the x-axis here, you've got three categories: none, which is the open syllable; voiced, which is the voiced syllables; and then voiceless, which is that. So in every speech, he unglides, he monophthongizes consistently. So I'll give you an example of that.
Yes, I am the co-pastor.
The Merv Griffin show, he does it in, let's see it.
1960. 1960.
And then also in Mountaintop.
That's always the problem with a little violence.
He also consistently doesn't. So these bars here show that they're quite a bit, he glides in the appropriate context.
Who was a student at the White Plains High School.
So you can actually see two tokens of the same thing, where he does it in one. He glides in white and unglides in high.
Who was a student at the White Plains High School.
Okay, so the takeaway from this is that in The Dream and the Mountaintop, he consistently has a split between the two, between the non and voiced and the voiceless consonants, which is in line with southernness. It's in line with all of his contemporaries. But in the Merv Griffin show and the Nobel Prize, which are more formal and more relaxed, he manipulates it. So you can see that in the middle, on the right side of the graph, you've got that middle bar creeping up there, creeping up towards the top, meaning that it's more glided. So you have a higher frequency. He just glides more often than in the other ones. All right, so I think I'm turning it to Walter.
So I have 5 minutes to tell you what this all means. Okay, we'll try to do it. So here's the point. So there are a lot of different things that can be indexed, ranging from informal, formal, Southern, Black, and so forth. And so we took sort of these various things and what they indicate and did this chart to say where King is coming. Okay, so here are the things. And these relationships indicate a number of different oppositions. Black versus white, black, the audience, whether it's a black versus non-black audience, the performance, whether it's a sort of interview versus a scripted speech like the Nobel Prize. And then there's regionality in terms of southernness and non-southernness or northernness. And then urban versus rural. So all of these things are going on in terms of how he manipulates these features. And here's what we learned from him. One is that his speech highlighted his regional heritage. So he was always, wherever he spoke, he was always Southern. Okay, so that's important. So he never gave up his Southernness, which is important given the fact that Southern speech is among the most reviled ways of speaking historically in terms of what people think. All right? And over time, it went from stigmatized to sort of the rich cadences of King Georgian accented oratory. All right? He also indicated his ethnicity. So if you look at his Southern vowels, if you look at his African American vowels, you look at features that are associated with African American speech. So he was also, even though he manipulated lots of stuff in terms of formality and informality, he's what we call manifesting intentional blackness. That is, talking black through dialect, dress, and public expression and prioritization of black political issues. And this is from Dyson, the sociologist. All right, so in fact, his speech, and one of the places that we found some stuff was, there's a site where you can read about people who were transformed and went through conversion experiences in terms of prejudice, all right? And so they talk about when I was prejudiced and so forth. And it's interesting that one of the quotes we have is, I was so racist I could not listen to Dr. Martin Luther King speak because of his accent. So he was clearly ethnically and regionally defined, all right? And he also embraced his cultural tradition because some of the things that he did were clearly Southern preacher style. But for us, the most significant thing is, so he took two features of American English that are among the most stigmatized in our society: African American speech and Southern speech. And without surrendering any aspect of that, he in a sense transformed and transcended linguistic diversity. So he is, in effect, the #1 model of what you say is more significant than how you talk, right? And in a sense, that's the lesson that he gave to us. And so over the last 3 years or so, we've been trying to implement, thanks to Stephanie Dunstan and some of the people around here, a program on NC State's campus in which we're trying to include language diversity in the entire diversity canon. So we all know the canonical features of diversity, right? Sex, gender, religion, sexual preference and all those things, race. Where's language? And what we're trying to say is that language is as important as anything. So in that context, we've done everything from sort of linguistic videos, and I'll just take 1 minute here to sort of show you one of our videos. I won't show you the whole thing, just the beginning. So the dialect of Warrington, it's a little different from here, huh?
Right.
Just like my friends, they don't know what a pack of nabs is. They call it a pack of peanut butter crackers. We call it a pack of nabs.
Well, most of my life I ended up coming back and forth to Raleigh, so I'm pretty adjusted to the accent. But a lot of people tell me I have a country accent.
Do you think you do?
Yes, but it's not indicative of Franklinton. I just have a different. My mom doesn't sound anything like me. It's just the way I talk, I guess.
When I got here, or when I go somewhere else, people can tell that I'm from an urban area because I talk different, I guess, differently. It definitely is a different dialect because I guess there's a certain slang.
So we won't go into that anymore, but it's a 5-minute video in which we sort of have people identify where they're from and how our university campus is made up of all these different voices. And one of the things we're trying to do is incorporate this into the program and say that, look, are we doing enough on NC State's campus to, one, counteract the myths that exist about language differences, and two, to celebrate dialect diversity. And one of the things that we say is even our teachers, are among people who reproduce linguistic inequality, okay? And Stephanie's study, she sort of had lots of, she did a study of Appalachian English speakers on a southern urban campus, all right? And the things that they say that indicate sort of how speaking this dialect does in fact affect how people view. And actually, this is one of my favorite quotes, because it took place in Tompkins Hall where I teach every day. And the week before, I gave the first lecture on linguistic diversity on NC State's campus. I was walking down the hall and I heard this wonderful conversation between two people flirting. And he says to them, Asians have weird accents. They use sounds that don't even exist. And the guy says, yeah, that's true. Okay. Heck with that. They use sounds that don't even exist. But this is a casual conversation that took place in our halls, so there are. But, here's one of the things that is really interesting. Academics tend to be, particularly in the humanities and social sciences, tend to be quite liberal and progressive about lots of things, but it doesn't include language. Look at this quote here, right? Accent and dialect are still barely on many people's minds as deserving respect. As a matter of fact, Stephanie's study showed that kids from Appalachia get more intolerance in courses in the social sciences and humanities than they do in the hard sciences, right? So the people that we think are the liberal, sort of progressive people are in fact reproducing linguistic inequality. What's it? Yes. Yeah, I was going to skip it. So we've been doing a lot of things. I'm just going to play one quick segment here that we recently did. Okay, which is
I'm from Durham, North Carolina. I study animal science and I sound like a scholar.
I'm from Charlotte and I'm a human bio major and I sound like a scholar.
I'm from Nepal. I study business admin. And I sound like a scholar.
At NC State, we have students from all 100 North Carolina counties, all 50 U.S. states, and 119 countries from around the world.
Okay, so this goes on, as you can see. And the idea is that scholarship doesn't come in a particular dialect. It comes in a range of voices. So the point that we're trying to say here is that applying King's legacy is applying his lesson of social justice and how he, in fact, transcended the sort of stigma of Southern African American speech and became the greatest orator of our time. Okay, and so just in passing, one of the things that's really interesting is that what we're saying is not a diatribe against sort of like standard English, but it's sort of like a concern for inclusion of different voices. And one of the things that I love about the conclusion of Selma was the fact that you have John Legend, who's sort of a standard English speaker. He has a degree in literature from the University of Pennsylvania, and the rapper Common, who happens to go to Barack Obama's church in Chicago, and how they combine two different voices.
One day, when the glory comes, it will be ours, it will be ours. Oh, one day, when the war is won, we will be sure, we will be sure. Oh, glory, 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 oh, glory, glory.
Hands to the heavens, no man, no weapon formed against, yes, glory is destined. Everyday women and men become legends. Sins that go against our skin become blessings. The movement is a rhythm to us. Freedom is like religion to us. Justice is juxtaposition in us. Justice for all just ain't specific enough. One son died, the spirit is revisiting us. True and living in us. Resistance is us. That's why Rosa sat on the bus. That's why we walk through Ferguson with our hands up. When it go down, we woman and man up. They say stay down, and we stand up. Shots be on the ground, the camera panned up. King pointed to the mountaintop, and we ran up. One day.
So the point you see here is you see sort of a standard mainstream song in standard English, and you also see the inclusion of a rapper who uses lots of the features of African American speech in a beautiful sort of unification of different voices to spread this story of diversity. So that's what we're trying to do here on campus. You know, some of the films you see, you will see in orientation and different workshops and so forth. And that's why we think that it's not enough to simply analyze how King talked, but he had great lessons of social justice related to language that are pertinent to this campus as well as everywhere. So thank you very much. So we have a few minutes for questions. I have a radio interview that I have to do at 6:30 back in another office. Yeah, you looked at your watch, but I'm quick, man. I'm live. I sting like a butterfly. Okay, so if you have any questions, we'll be happy to answer them. And in 5 minutes, I'll leave, come hell or high water. You have any questions? Yeah.
Are you trying to say that like language should become like an entity now? Like in comparison to like race and sex and
Yes. Yes. What we're saying is that language is sort of one of the invisibles of inequality and discrimination, and that we have to confront language diversity as we do any other kind of diversity. That's our point, yeah. And it ranges from encounters where people claim that they can't understand people, you know, because they don't speak standard English, to assessments of people's intelligence as unintelligent because they talk this funny dialect. So yes, that's what we're trying to do. And it's interesting because we're quite aware of all of the diversity programs around the country. And in fact, there are no programs that include language as a part of diversity. And what we're saying is we must include it, that we're doing that at NC State, and we're trying to set an example to other universities around the country. Yeah?
Why do you think it might not be?
Why do I think it might not be? I don't know. Do you have an answer to that? Yeah, why isn't it included?
I think that you mentioned the fact that it is invisible in terms of like we're really good at categorizing people, but because there's not much done in schools related to language varieties besides wrong and right, I don't think that we think much about it beyond just right language and wrong language. So I don't even know that people think about it being a facet of identity in the same way as that.
Yeah.
Everyone is overtly aware of it in themselves.
Yeah.
Coming up the way they are.
I
I think part of it has to do with the ego. If I can't understand you, it can't possibly be a problem with me. Right?
Yeah, that's true, but then the issue is where did that come from to begin with, you know? And we know this, that kids in preschool from 3 to 5, we have tests that show that kids 3 to 5 in preschool develop strong discrimination against other dialects. I mean, they're empirical tests. So in one study, there were puppets, all right? And they were offering notebooks, color books, and crayons or crowns, however you say that. I say crowns because I'm from Philadelphia, all right? And so they were asked, and they were given different voices, all right? Same offer, same box. One was an African-American voice, one was a middle-class white voice. These were white kids. You can tell what the results are, right? And then when kids say, well, why do you want to take it from him? Oh, because he's mean, right? So these are, you can't ask overtly 3 to 5-year-olds, but you can develop tasks that show that they're developing very early attitudes of linguistic prejudice and discrimination. So, but as Caroline said, you know, the fact that it's not overtly discussed anywhere, you know, and it's sort of like before gender and sex were overtly discussed, you know, people didn't sort of understand it, just took it for granted. This is the way the world is and this is normal. And so what we're trying to do is say that no, this is not normal about language. And we're trying to raise that consciousness. But that's a really good question. I wish I had a better answer. Any other questions? Yeah.
So why do you think Ebonics failed in this notion of, you know, creating a parallel language or a parallel understanding, right? Because
yeah. Well, the Ebonics program in Oakland, you know, failed because it ran in the face of, well, there are two things, and I hate to sort of jump on a Trump bandwagon, but the media didn't understand it all and presented it very differently. So that was one issue. And the other issue was that it was presented as such as sort of extremist kind of reaction that it was just too far out there. But in reality, here's what the program was trying to do, okay? They were trying to teach the kids of Oakland standard English. And their position was, if teachers know about their home dialect and about its structure, they'll facilitate the learning of standard English much more, which is true, you know, in terms of what we know about education. That's what they were trying to do. It's actually a very conservative thing, but totally got sort of miscommunicated and caught up in a deeper ideological struggle, and that is the struggle of the legitimacy of African American speech.
so on that note, isn't that reason why language diversity is not known, because we have one standard language?
Yeah, because because we've been socialized into there's one standard language and everything else is bad. And so that's what we're trying to confront by saying everything else isn't bad. You know, it may be socially stigmatized, but linguistically it's just as cool. And that's and so what we need is we need educational programs in schools about language diversity, which we have in North Carolina now. And we need public programs like our film, Talking Black in America, that tries to sort of talk about the history, the systematicity, and its use, the use of this variety in very constructive sort of performance, such as preaching and rap and so forth. Yeah. One more question for somebody else on the panel? I think that sort of.
No one wanted to ask about bimorphic consonant clustering?
Keep that stuff to class. Well, I hope you sort of, it makes you think about sort of what we need to start considering if we're going to be truly diverse. You know, we have, and as I say, we have this canon. Here are the things that are part of diversity. But, you know, we have a society which is not limited to that canon. And we need to sort of confront the whole range of things and items and variables that is used to sort of perpetuate and reproduce inequality, and language is prominent among them. So thank you very, very much for staying even beyond an hour, because it's really awkward to get up and walk out after an hour. But thanks for staying, and thanks for your attention. And if you have any questions, we're always available. I'm not available right now, but they are, and we'll be happy to talk to you more about it. Thank you. You can get up now.